All right, welcome everybody to the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you very much for coming. I am delighted that we're hosting Simeon Djankov, who is going to discuss the World Bank's 2020 Doing Business ratings. We're going to do that. After that, we'll have a discussion about these ratings, including Q&A. So prepare your questions. Make sure they end in question marks and that they are concise. We will also have two expert panelists joining us to discuss the rankings. My colleague James Petrakoukas and Danny Bahar of the Brookings Institution. If you are here because you wanted to watch Monica de Bolle of the Peterson Institute, I'm sad to report that she could not make it at the last minute, so you are free to depart or listen to the other speakers instead. Anyway, so with that out of the way, I want to ask Simeon to give his presentation. Pay close attention, and you will learn. Thank you.
I'll start perhaps from an unusual point, which is that in the last few days, weeks, we have witnessed quite a lot of social unrest in some countries that previously were considered the paradigm of stability. I'm talking about Chile. Some countries that have had on and off unrest, and the political system somehow had supposedly reflected that and had gone to perhaps better representation, and yet we see social unrest coming. I'm talking about Bolivia. And then a number of other countries around the world, starting from Iraq, Lebanon, Indonesia, Turkey. It seems that perhaps for different reasons, perhaps for the same reasons, a lot of people are unhappy about the way that they live. So the question is why? Why is it that this is happening now? How is this different from previous periods of social upheaval that generally have gone with financial or economic crisis? So what's interesting about this period is that it doesn't yet, or at least not yet, coincide with a particular global crisis. So somehow it's driven by something else than just an economic downturn. But by the way, a few seats here for the people who are standing, so perhaps you can take them. So what I'll try to make as an argument using some of the doing business data is that when we discuss social unrest, we typically think of under-delivery or bad delivery of public services. When we think of fairly basic services, like if you don't have water, if you don't have sanitation, if you don't have electricity, if you don't have basic health or education, it's not surprising that people stand up and demand a different environment. But what if the delivery of public services goes beyond that? So it's not just that people want these basics, but they want a different way for the government to operate. And I'll be illustrating with some examples from doing business. These are some of the leaders. You can see Evo Morales wondering what happened to me. I was elected in a landslide some 13 years ago as representing indigenous communities, representing change, representing the new way of running politics in a country, and now I need to run to Mexico because people hate me. And why do people hate me? It's of course much more complicated than what I would be suggesting, so I'm giving just one correlate of that. But just to point out that a lot of arguments. So when we economists think of societal change or societal upheaval in this point, we always have to ask ourselves, so what are the fundamentals of this? Is something happening that finally people are so fed up that they want a change? And these actually data, this is the median. So I now go to doing business. I'll show you in a moment, for those of you who don't know very well the doing business project, what this is about. But basically the doing business project measures, if you like, regulatory business competitiveness. It asks the question in any one of 190 countries around the world, how do you design your regulatory system, and is it easy for businesses to start and operate? So it's from the perspective of the business community, not of large businesses. So these are not foreign direct investment, huge companies. This is actually typically very small companies, up to 10 people, who operate in urban areas by definition. And the question is how easy it is for them to operate. So we rank every year 190 countries over nearly 20 years. And what I show you here is for the last 15 years, the average, and we've tried this with median as well, for the Latin American region versus the average from Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, where I come from. At the end of the presentation, hopefully it becomes apparent why I am comparing these two regions, but just from an economic perspective, an obvious comparison. By and large, these are regions with middle-income countries. So there is no, of course, some countries have poverty, and even in some of the middle-income countries, there are pockets of poverty. But by and large, these countries should provide for their population basic services. They should provide healthcare. They should provide education. They have enough money to do so. What you see here is this striking difference between 15 years ago and now, which is that Latin America has been essentially sinking in competitiveness rankings. So for the business, again, not for foreign companies, for small domestic companies, the situation has been worsening. And then in the latest Doing Business report, we go even further than that and say in every country, without exception, every Latin American country over the last 15 years actually has worsened relative to the rest of the world. It may be that the rest of the world is improving faster, so that they're not really getting worse, it's just that the rest of the world is passing them, or in some countries like Venezuela being the extreme case. Venezuela actually in these rankings ranks lower than Yemen, which is quite an achievement. I've been to Yemen in my, naive youth. To be worse than Yemen, you really need to try very hard to screw up your business environment. But even if you adjust for that, even if you don't look at averages but medians, you have this picture. So Eastern Europe is improving tremendously over these 15 years, and Latin America is going down. Now you may be thinking by now, okay, so he's going to give us the story that because of doing business, this is what's happening to Evo Morales and Piñera in Chile and Macri in Argentina and so on. No, that's not what I'm suggesting. There are many more probably fundamental reasons for that happening. I'm just saying that if you're thinking about social unrest, you start thinking of what is it that people want? And they want these basic services that I've mentioned, but ultimately they also want jobs, so they want income. So the question is, how do you create income in these countries? And the answer has to be, in the vast majority of cases, the private sector that creates this income and these jobs. And if you see this striking picture that basically Latin America is going down, down, down in its competitiveness, well, it's not surprising that they don't have many jobs. This translates into very low levels of economic growth. If you look at economic growth in the majority of these countries, you're quite startled. It cannot be that they're growing at half a percentage point a year, but they are. So in many of these countries, individually we say they have a lost decade, a lost 2 decades, and so on. The whole region, however, this is the message here, has been sinking. Why am I presenting this as a way to get you into doing business is to say that you can look at country by country and say which country is doing relatively better than others, which is not. But by now, with nearly 20 years of data, you can also look at regions, you can look at types of countries, you can look by types of political system, for example, and say, well, is it true that countries that are more democratic are improving faster? The answer is no. So we like democracy for what it is, but actually in terms of at least improvement of the business environment, it's not correlated to better positions or environment for companies. So you can do a lot of analysis with it. So now that I've shown you this, I'll go backwards somewhat in time. First, of course, boasting that in addition to the wonderful analysis that you can do, this is a rare circumstance where On the same day, both the Pakistan Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister were tweeting at the same time saying nice things about the World Bank. Never happens, probably would never happen again, so we should really savor it. That it does attract attention. So even at the highest level of government, both for good or bad, people actually do notice. I think the reason that they notice is that it's truly a global comparison. So actually the picture to the right is, well, the only picture is at the ASEAN summit, where India, as you may know, is not an ASEAN member, so it is in the process of applying for ASEAN membership. So the speech that Prime Minister Modi was giving was literally, we can teach you a lot of things, so we India can contribute a lot to ASEAN, and one of the things that we can contribute is the ease of doing business, because we have been reforming and we know the difficulties, but also the benefits of reform, and probably there are some of the other leaders sitting or standing next to him thinking, sure, you're the one who teach us, we're much better than you, but they're not saying it. And the Economist also actually thinks that this is a good project. This is from 2 weeks ago, rather 3 weeks ago, that basically says it's interesting that, I'm paraphrasing, that such a small, not particularly hugely funded effort can get China, India, Saudi, and a variety of other countries to pay attention. Why are they paying attention? I think they're paying attention because they are thinking of themselves as global players, so they're comparing themselves to the world or to other regional countries, players, and thinking we want to attract more, both to attract more investment from outside, but also to have our businesses do better. So going back to methodology then, what is it that doing business covers? So I already mentioned to you, so if you think of a small company in a large business city, the largest in most countries, you want to go through the life cycle of the company. And that goes back to De Soto, Hernando De Soto, but actually the methodology of time and motion studies, in fact, goes to Henry Ford, way before De Soto, of saying, if I have a complicated process, I want to subdivide it into steps, and I want to research every step and figure out how to improve every possible step. So you open a business, you get a location for this business, you access finance, and so on. So at the very bottom, there are the different steps or the different types of regulation that the project covers. One criticism is that, okay, but there are certainly other things that matter, like if you have a very uncertain macroeconomic environment, and if you have very high inflation, then it doesn't matter how quick or cheap it is to start a business, you're not going to start it because inflation is going to eat away your profits. And our answer to that is absolutely true. Fortunately, there is a lot of statistics on inflation at the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. So you combine these statistics with statistics of political uncertainty, with statistics or data for some of the other major influencers or correlates of economic growth, or as I mentioned, of social development, and then you put them together in analysis. And there have been a lot of analysis done, mostly outside of the World Bank, on these indicators. So every year, as I mentioned, the report, the Doing Business study, ranks countries. New Zealand is always first. They get very excited about that. Not many things. I think the only other thing that New Zealand is first is number of sheep per population. So, but they're not very proud of that statistic, so they don't flaunt it too much. Singapore is always upset that they're number 2, so they're considering how to improve that. And then there are a number of countries, of which some surprises. So if you look at this list, Georgia immediately comes up as a surprise, and people say it cannot be that a small, formerly Soviet Union country can do well. I worked a number of years back in Georgia, as have actually many of our colleagues from different think tanks around Washington. And I can tell you that over a period, this was about 10, 15 years ago, over a period of 4 or 5 years, actually Georgia did a lot. They basically said exactly the question that I'll be asking at the end of the presentation. What's really the scope of government? Like if you can start from scratch, because remember the situation there was so desperate, just like it is now in Bolivia, that they could ask themselves this question. If you were to start from scratch, forget what you have now, how do you do it? and they had the political backing. They had an external enemy, which was Russia, threatening them all the time. So they thought, we're going to really do something radically different. I was part of some of these changes where, in one day, the whole customs office was fired. Everybody. So everybody was fired from the customs office on the argument of it's so corrupt that even if you just open the borders, it cannot be worse. So Georgia, this was 2005. For about three months, just didn't have, you could go in and out. There was nobody at the customs office until they built it from scratch. And they put requirements on knowing English, for example, as a way to clean up and have younger people and so on. About 6 months after that, they fired all police. You could not find a single policeman in the streets on the argument it's so corrupt you need to start from scratch. Very few countries can do that. It sounds like this type of shock and awe approach should be used in many countries. For political reasons, very difficult to do it, unless you're very desperate, or unless you're a nation state that is just being built. So you start from scratch, South Sudan, countries like that, and you decide, why don't I think differently? Why don't I think of what's the scope of government services? Every year as well, we show the countries, the top 10 countries that reform the fastest in that particular 1 year. And we actually give the examples of exactly what they did. Within this narrow area, again, remember that there are many other things that matter in the business environment. Macro matters, political stability matters, infrastructure matters. We cover some of infrastructure here. We're just looking at regulation. If you're a government and a legislation, not just the executive, a legislator that wants to do well for your businesses, but also for jobs, for social improvement, how do you design these? So these are some countries that Saudi Arabia actually did a lot this year. Jordan, in fact, the Middle East is improving a lot. That actually gives you trends. So I showed you one trend over 15 years of Latin America versus East Asia. A trend that we're in the midst of is Middle Eastern countries, in particular Gulf countries, improving. So the economists among us can ask the question, why are they improving? And then we can immediately think of an answer, which is with the volatility of the price of oil and also alternatives to oil and gas, these countries start being somewhat anxious about what the future of their economies is, because they only have that. They haven't really developed anything else. So when you talk to their reformers, it's not that they suddenly got reform-minded. It's that they realized that without making some of these changes in 5 years, 10 years' time, they themselves are going to have social unrest. And some of these countries had in the past. They didn't like it much, so they are trying to do something for the average company, not just for the Aramco and the large oil companies, but something for the average entrepreneur in their countries. Some examples of reforms, but before I get there, going back to Latin America, again to point out that you look at this region, some of the commentators may comment on it, and you basically see that nothing is happening over the last 10, 15 years. If you go 15 years back, we could show, including in our report, and if you go back even further, you can show in trade liberalization, for example, in macroeconomic reform from the 80s and 90s, Colombia, Mexico, Chile certainly from the 70s and 80s. These were some of the countries that we're giving as examples of how development should be. So something has happened in the last decade plus. These are not the countries that we should be learning from. And they're the extremes of Venezuela, I mentioned. It's how not to do things. So we can learn from it. But it's not just that. It's Argentina, it's Brazil, it's Mexico. So somehow that region is falling behind across the board. And I think that's actually a useful analysis for both regional economists. Monica would have been great at that to comment. But also others to look. What is useful for analysis in the report, in the Doing Business studies, that, as I mentioned, we have the reforms and the great details of these reforms. So for every country, for every year, we can tell you what they did and exactly how they did it. So we have this scripts, if you like, of what a country did, how it happened, what was the result this year, next year, and so on. And I think these scripts are very useful, not just within the World Bank, but for the reformers in other countries as well as for anybody who visits these countries and wants to help improve, to say, okay, this other country did it this way, so why don't you think of doing it this way or different way as well? And we know from our analysis when we travel that frequently, like Togo was a top 10 reformer this year, we asked, how did you get excited about this? They visited Rwanda, and Rwanda was so, Kagame was so excited about reform in Rwanda that somehow at the time, new president of Togo said we can also do it. And after 2 years, they have started doing it. China, a topic interesting in Washington of late, and actually always, China has been improving a lot on this. At first, many commentators said it cannot be, it's a state-run economy, this is probably a bit fake, like other things that we suspect coming from that part of the world. But in fact, there has been lots of analysis on this, and the Chinese government, somewhat like the Saudi government and other governments in the Gulf, and actually many other countries in the world, I think have this thought process of we need to improve on this precisely because of jobs, precisely so that we don't have on our hands some very unhappy people because they don't have the job opportunities, because they don't have the income opportunities. So better reform. So China over the last 2 years consistently has been one of the top reformers and is now right around where France is. I'm not going to comment on France because I always get into trouble on any French comments, but just to say that, China now, for the average domestic company, I'm not talking about large state-owned enterprise or banks that have lots of different issues, but the average small company in China has about the same business environment as in France. Pakistan is a recent joiner of the club. They're particularly excited to be in this club for 2 reasons. One is that India lately has been reforming a lot, and this regional competition always gets very exciting. Hence the picture of Prime Minister Khan and Prime Minister Modi at the beginning. I was recently there. They, of course, don't admit that they are looking very intently on India, but they are. So many of the reforms that they are doing actually resemble reforms that have just been done in India, and that's good. It provides competition that ultimately, if it also goes beyond doing business, so not just on these specific indicators, can actually benefit countries. Next year, very exciting year for the team. Where after 12 years of the same indicators, we're adding a new indicator on dealing with the government, so procurement. This is an area that people like myself who have spent time in public finance know that if you're running a government and you don't know what your expenditures are, or if there's huge corruption in your expenditures, which is basically every country in the world, then you're wasting a lot of opportunities to use this money, save them for some other social or economic projects. So it's one of the topics that perhaps is most relevant for the bigger question of what's the scope of government, what can you do on the government side. We already have the data for the last 2-3 years. We're adding an indicator, and if I do well today and you clap a lot, then I'll be invited again and I'll present you the procurement indicator in several months. Heads up, what happens in some of it is that some of the richest countries, particularly continental European countries, do terribly on it. And the reason that they do terribly is that they have their own national regulation, and they have Brussels, who basically thinks that the more regulation you put, the better. And it turns out that in procurement, and we have a lot of research to show this, the more regulation is by and large not good. So you have some basic transparency regulation that you need in order for as many people as possible to know what's happening and to be able to make sure that the process is efficient. And beyond this, once you start imposing additional regulation, it basically serves as a way to organize collusion. So it's almost good for collusion and anti-competitive behavior because the government now has just told you how legally to collude. And Europeans are very excited about legal collusion, so as a result, they're not going to be happy a year from now when the indicator comes. Just to note a sore point for me, at least personally, that at the beginning of this project, there was a set of indicators on employing workers, on labor regulation. The then Democratic administration of the US pushed very hard against it in Congress and managed to remove it from doing business in the ranking. So perhaps think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute can make a lot of noise and perhaps make the point that without labor regulation being part of the business environment, it's kind of difficult to imagine exactly how a country can more efficiently run its business. So I'll go then to the last two slides of back to Latin America and Eastern Europe. So a lot of this work, at least the inspiration of this work for me, personally came from two sources. De Soto, or the work on informality in Latin America from the late 80s, actually mid to late 80s, where, as you remember the other path from De Soto, he was making this point that nobody in their right mind in Latin America forms companies, legal companies, because it's so complicated, it's so expensive to do it. So he did this hypothetical example of a garment factory in Lima with 2 sewing machines that it would take 289 days to establish, and some ridiculous amounts of money to do it, and said, okay, let's improve this. And there was improvement, as you can see, between 83 when he first did it and 2002 for about a 20-year period, coinciding actually with democratic reforms in the late 80s, early 90s in many of these countries. The process became a lot faster and a lot better. So if we only ended then, we could have congratulated ourselves and De Soto, given him the Nobel Prize, and said, that's great. So Latin America is now a much better place. If you fast forward from 2002 to 2019, Latin America, as I showed you, on many indicators has actually reversed and is now much more complicated and much more expensive to start a business, to operate business, and so on. Which makes 2 points. One, reforms are reversible, so you can improve, but you can also sink a lot. Venezuela being the prime example at the moment of how an upper middle income countries can screw up so many things in such a short period of time that 20-25% of its population want to leave. Actually, 75% of the population want to leave. 25 have managed to leave. And then the puzzle, which I'll leave you with, just this past Sunday was the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. My generation from Eastern Europe lived through this. Some of us had just left before, some of us left later, but this freedom of movement, which before that was not there for East Europeans, has been one of the defining features of this generation, the generation that is sitting on this wall in Berlin. But as I showed you at the beginning, somehow Eastern Europe did some things, not that there is no social discontent, there is in some of these countries, but somehow governments, successive governments in the vast majority of East European and former Soviet Union countries like Georgia have kind of said, we need the government to work for the business, the small domestic business, because that's where the jobs are, that's where the growth is. We sort of get this development paradigm. So East Europeans get it, Latin Americans don't get it. Why is that? My 2 distinguished commentators will answer this question. Thank you. Should I sit
Right in the middle. Jim, you ready to roll? Let's do it. Danny, just so you know, these chairs are extremely uncomfortable. So it's not you.
Why don't you tell it to everybody else?
They come from the Star Trek set, actually, where they originate.
Thank you.
That's right. Simeon, thank you very much. I'm going to at first ask Danny, who's going to partially play the role Monica was supposed to play, and ask about Latin America. So we've seen that the numbers there have not improved in a way they have in other parts of the world. There do seem to be these regional spillovers, maybe in part because of competition, maybe because civil unrest has been sort of correlated across countries within the same region. So, Danny, why do you think Latin America has not made progress on these indicators in the way that, for example, Central and Eastern Europe have done?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between the score and the ranking, but we did talk offline before that also you see that same trend on the score. You know, I think it's also right that what you've seen in Latin America in the past, the quote-unquote success in the growth of the economies in Latin America until maybe 5 years ago, I think it's fair to say now we know that you know, it was not sustainable in many cases because it was a commodity boom, and in the case of Venezuela, they just did exactly the opposite of what you would learn in an Econ 101 textbook. So, I mean, the question I have, or I want to answer this with a question, being an economist, which is like, you know, to what extent, I think that there are many other forces that are explaining, like maybe the reforms that countries in different levels of their stage of development are focusing on. And the one question that, so in that sense, I think Latin America could have been or should have been or focusing on different types of reforms that might not be completely reflected here. And in that sense, I guess that there's an open question that I think applies to all the regions, which is to what extent this is a linear process, right? To what extent the Doing Business indicator, which has been tremendously successful and used to measure you know, roughly speaking, the institutional setting for the private sector, to what extent is a linear process in which moving from rank, you know, 55 to 50 is as important of moving from rank 125 to 120. And I think that, you know, in that sense, that could explain the mirror image. Why maybe in Latin America, at least until 2015, why, despite the fact that you haven't seen a huge improvement, you still saw some growth in those economies, and I think that opens that question.
And so, Simeon, you may be able to speak to that, right? So one thing you see, you look at the ranking, there's a bunch of Western European countries that aren't ranked particularly high, right? And surely those governments are aware of the rankings, and certainly on some indicators, it's a conscious choice not to maximize their score, right? So one thing you can do, you can cut taxes on the procurement side. As you mentioned, there are just different views of how things are supposed to work. How do you think of that? Do you believe in what Danny is saying, that, you know, look, maybe there's a certain development model you want to follow, and it just doesn't do that well on the ratings, and that's not necessarily a sign of poor governance or poor planning? It's simply an ideological dispute over what the way to go is. Before you answer, there are two extremely bright lights that I am staring right into. Can we dim those in any kind of way? Because
actually there are four. I'm looking.
Oh, do you have the same problem?
But he can't see those, so that's
I
why
can
we're
see those. Just
those are fine.
Those are fine.
You look good though, so you should keep them.
No one knows where they come from? Okay. Well,
Or where they're going.
Well, I don't know what they're doing, but they're extremely bright.
Yeah, we're checking on that.
Okay,
we need
thank
them for
you.
the webcast. Thank you. Just one moment.
All right. Anyway, so, yeah.
So I have two
Because,
ways.
for example, your explanation for why has the Gulf improved so much is, you know, if you say, oh, the oil price is volatile, well, that's like the central macroeconomic challenge for Latin America too, right? So that, you know, obviously all these things are overdetermined, but yeah.
So ideology, of course, matters in this, which is why Latin America is a surprise for me, is a enigma in some sense, because there's Bolivia, which went over the last 15 years very left-wing, so to speak, and there's Chile, that traditionally has been very right-wing. So, you know, the current government is by standard economics, a very center-right government. In Chile, I mentioned. So Latin America is not subject to this left-right, it seems. Wherever you're in Latin America, you do wrong things. Okay. Eastern Europe is very much about ideology. This is why I started with Georgia and so on. So you start from a communist regime where you cannot do anything. So everything is in the state domain. There is no freedom of travel, freedom of business and so on. You open up, everybody, even the socialists, are basically right-wing relative to everybody else, so they go in this direction, and you see every country goes in this direction. So then you say, well, okay, ideology explains some countries and not other countries. Economic need, this is where the Gulf comes. So these are very rich countries so far, but they start worrying that they're not going to be as rich in 10, 15 years, and therefore basic economics starts kicking in. I think the part that we know the least, and there is least research, is what else? So Eastern Europe also benefited tremendously from the opening of the European market. So if you're in Eastern Europe, you're free, but suddenly all the West European companies basically come to you. So unless you rapidly reform, you're obliterated. So this trade openness and ability to be part of a larger economic bloc plays a lot of.
Sorry, how much of it is exposure to trade openness versus meeting the requirements for joining the European Union? Is that part of?
Maybe I think the trade openness, because it starts a bit earlier for some of these countries like Bulgaria, which joined in 2007 the European Union, but already was reforming a lot from the early 2000s. And not just, I don't just talk about doing business, just general economic reform. If you look at Latin America, what's striking is on basic macroeconomic indicators. It's a very closed, Brazil is a very closed country, Argentina is a very closed country, Chile is a very close country, given its comparators like Korea and so on around the world. So somehow Latin America doesn't have a common denominator. Everybody is on their own. Eastern Europe has a common denominator, and that has helped it. Integration into the EU has helped in addition, but just this thing that, you have all the Germans and all the Austrians and so on coming to you, you better reform. And whether you're to the left or to the right, actually, in my own country, some of the toughest reforms, tax reform, labor reform, and so on, actually happened from socialist governments. If you think of Germany and the Hartz reforms on labor regulation, social democrats did the toughest reforms as well. But maybe others have.
Well, so Jim was a little surprised that the U.S. moved up this year because he thinks, the tariffs have gone up. How can this happen?
It seemed that there's no chance that the U.S. could be doing better. Granted, there were the tax cuts. Does that overwhelm the trade war? Are they that important that
they're just making everybody doing worse?
You're right. So it's the tax reform just because of the methodology. Once you reformed 2 years ago, the actual passage of corporate tax legislation in the U.S. happened, but then the doing business methodology waits for it to actually affect businesses, and because it's taken a year or two for businesses to see the effect of reforms, the corporate tax reform was tremendous. The U.S. was so much worse than other OECD countries that this corporate tax reform really helped it. My guess is that the effect of what you're mentioning, tariffs or in general trade, would come in a year or two. And that would be significant.
And if you're paying attention to the campaign, it seems that many of the Democrats would like to reverse those tax cuts, the business tax cuts. Some even saying, take that rate back up to 35% or higher. Then if that happened, then at some point that would then hurt the U.S. ranking
significantly. And just to note that the average for the OECD in corporate taxation is actually right around where the U.S. is now, 20.3% to be exact. So the US went from being terrible, so it was US, France, again, no comments on France, and then everybody else had actually already reformed. So the US actually just went to average. It's not like the least taxing country even in the OECD. Not, in Bulgaria, when I was finance minister, we did true flat tax, something that you talk a lot about here and never will be able to do it. We did 10% corporate, 10% personal income tax, 5% dividend tax. Works.
So what do you understand that the Democratic presidential candidates don't about corporate taxation?
Well, economics is for one, so you do need to understand basic economics. So I think the Democratic candidates are quite far from that. But also this spirit of America. It's quite interesting that if you go around countries, you still hear this American dream type of thing. Even in Saudi, you still hear, now here, we want to be like the US, like the land of free business and so on. The US is very far from currently being the land of free free business. It's gotten worse over time, some improvements here and there, but other countries actually, even in the OECD, I'm not talking about Georgia, Bulgaria, and so on, who could start from scratch. I understand it's much more complicated in a country like the US to do fundamental change. This is why the corporate tax reform is, I think, a significant step forward, but it's a one-off. How much more you can do like that? Probably not much.
So Saudi Arabia is a good opportunity to talk about the methodology a little bit, I think. So people will say, look, it's a dictatorship, it kills journalists. They recently rounded up the richest people in the country.
It's not people don't say it, they do.
Well, well, people will say, taking all of these facts into account, they lock up the richest people in the country and take their assets. How can they do well on a business environment survey? How do you respond to that? Because it is the number one in improvements this year, right? So can you explain a bit why those things don't end up factoring into the rating?
Oh, you can then say, well, Bolivia is a very democratic country, and look where it is now. So as I mentioned, if you
No, I don't mean the pure dictatorship aspect. I mean, for example, there's a minority shareholder protection category, right, in the index. Surely the people who were extorted in the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh,
yes,
were minority shareholders of companies, and their assets were seized from them by the government. How can you then move up in the rating if something like that happens?
So as I explained from the beginning, there are many other indicators that you should take into account before investing, particularly if you're a foreign investor, so you're kind of new to this environment. I would start with political certainty or uncertainty, of which some of the comments that you just made certainly count. Macro always matters. I think a big story of Latin America is, you go up, you go down, you go up, you go down on macro indicators. Turkey, Indonesia. So there are a number of countries that unless you do the macro right, it can be very easy to start a business, and it's also very easy to exit from a business, to go bust because of this cycle. So what we are trying to look here is a very narrow set of indicators of the intention of government of serving domestic business. So once you say that, it becomes, yes, governments can have different parts and different attitudes, and they can have very mean attitudes towards journalists or towards different parts of society. They can still say, we would want a good business environment for our domestic firms. Is this enough? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And that's where the analysis and this data come from.
So let me ask a question from the opposite, from the opposite point of the political spectrum.
I have questions on that. I want to develop.
All right, you can go first.
No, I mean, I think I want to weigh in on that conversation before we're talking about not knowing anything about American politics, but I want to say something about the...
I don't know. I think he seems to know a lot about American politics.
No, so. I mean, look, coming from a perspective of development economics, where this seems to be, or is an important tool, because as you said, I mean, it's not the magic bullet, but it provides a tool for a particular category of growth determinants, which are important to look at. And in that sense, I mean, I reinforce what I said before, that perhaps in some countries, and I'm saying this as encouragement also we have 20 years of data, and I think that this is one direction that would be really interesting to look at. There are some countries in which, other type of reforms are first order. I mean, when you look at Latin America, just with commodities, just creating a fund that allows you to run counter-cyclical policies, maybe
very
that's not
important.
reflected here, and that's... But then I wonder to what extent this creates an incentive for developing countries and I'm sure you heard this before many times, and I wonder if there's any work in the future thinking about this. To what extent this creates a little bit of a race to the bottom, in the sense like you want to be number one in the ranking, so we're cutting taxes, just... I mean, I think about the example you gave in the presentation about Georgia, right? So they decided to open the border freely for, you said 3 days?
3 months.
3 months. So did that mean that Georgia became number one for 3 months? I'm exaggerating the point, but you know what I mean? Like, whether it's for developing countries in particular, this sensation of just lowering regulation is the idea to get to a point where You have no regulation at all, where you're focusing only on things that maybe where there are market failures, you do need some regulation. So how does the methodology can tackle those, loopholes, or not loopholes, but ideas on where is the part where you say, hey, you're very good here, there's no need to keep reforming because it's not going to create much more a marginal increase. You have to focus on something else.
So I think that's where research comes, right? So as you said,
Right.
2 decades of data, 190 countries, so you have lots and lots of observations. You marry it with other data, outcome data, and so on, and you ask this question. So what is the right level of regulation? So there's the scope. Should the government be doing this or not? I think this is a very fundamental question that very few governments ask themselves, or politicians. And then, given that we should do it, what's the most efficient way to do it? And then the answer would surely differ across indicators. So we started with customs. So there's plenty of academic evidence that actually having no borders is much better than having borders, right? The European Union is the US actually is a great example of not having borders across states, other than some financial services and liquor and so on, where, where actually having no borders has great...
You know that the Maryland liquor monopoly ran a loss last year? Montgomery County, I think, runs its own...
which in itself is pretty amazing, how with a monopoly you can be as inefficient. Yeah. There are many examples of state-owned companies that actually are inefficient. But then in borders, removing all borders clearly is going to improve the economic lot of people on both sides. We know that. There are other considerations why some countries may not want to do that, but we have the US examples, we have the European Union example that has benefited greatly from that. In construction permits, for example, surely if you're constructing something, you want to make sure that it's going to be there for some time and not collapse onto people's head. So you want some level of regulation. The question is, what is the level? And the answer is, most countries have no idea. So typically what happens is that there is some disaster, something collapses, they put more regulation because that seems like the right thing to do. Or in our client countries, the World Bank client countries, the OECD comes, they live in Paris, they look sophisticated, they must know what they're doing. So they go to Congo or Liberia and they say, this is what you should do. This is like the best practice for constructing warehouses or for procurement and so on. Country doesn't know better, so they say, sure, we'll implement the OECD principles. Sounds good, and it turns out not to work. So it's not it's not zero, it's not that level, but I think unless we create a database for researchers, not just the World Bank, everybody to look at it, I think then it's just ideology. And then we come to the US examples. US has the best, probably 95% of the top economies in the world are currently in the US. You would think that there will be lots and lots of research on what's the optimal level of taxation. And actually, there is a lot of research on the optimal level of taxation. It's not 21%, it's around 15% if the latest studies are. But we are not there yet. Why? Well, politics also matters. I think we need to consider the politics in Latin America. We spoke about this, the politics in Eastern Europe, the politics in France. We don't get to the optimal, or we rarely get to the optimal, but at least we should know what it is. Otherwise, we're shooting in the dark.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what you said earlier about the labor market regulations?
Well, when the project started, we looked at academic research, and basically we said, what are the types of regulation that are creating the biggest constraints, basically, that businesses talk about. Businesses immediately start talking about how much taxes they pay. So, tax regulation clearly matters a lot, how you start, bankruptcy, and so on. So, in terms of academic research, actually, the number 2 after taxes immediately is labor regulation. Just in terms of the research that suggests what matters in different countries and so on.
There's some Nobel Prizes, Pissarides.
A bunch of Pissarides, Gary Becker. Actually, there are many Nobel Prizes in labor. So we, reasonable people, we decided to have a set of indicators on labor regulation around the world. And for 7 or 8 years, that was part of the Doing Business ranking. We still collect this data, but there was a discussion, mostly coming from US labor unions, actually, of this is terrible stuff, we should not have that part, precisely for the argument of we don't know where the right level is, so we need to somehow take it out, research it, which never happens once you take it out. So for the last 10 years or so, labor regulation has not been part of the aggregate ranking. What happens, you can see very much. So the moment that it was taken out, countries don't reform it. Some countries reform it, just like I gave the Germany examples, because they truly believe in it. But most of the developing countries say...
This is a good natural experiment.
Exactly, so it's a good natural experiment of what drives what. So a lot less labor reform has happened in the last decade as a result of this in our client countries. This is not an issue for an OECD economy.
Well, I mean, shouldn't we be concerned that future American governments or the current American government may have certain thoughts about what should be included in these scores, perhaps on issues such as trade, and there could be future changes which might not be particularly beneficial or instructive to other countries wanting to use these indexes to improve their economy?
It's a political process, just like reform in any country is a political process, and then our way of thinking was, let's see what academic research suggests. Is it important? Is it not important? Even if it's important, is there enough evidence for it? So do we know what to do? Like what set of indicators to construct? So it happens that labor regulation, as I mentioned, after taxes and public finance, is the second most richly researched area. So there are many good papers, starting from Gary Becker and so on, starting from Keynes as well, that write a lot about what type of regulation for what type of countries, not the same regulation that you have in Germany versus Bolivia and so on. So on that, I feel pretty good in actually saying this should be there. We know how to do it. There is evidence to suggest. If you go to an area, let's say like intellectual property rights, we agree that this is an important area and countries and firms shouldn't be stealing other people's intellectual property rights, and it does matter. But then you go to the pharmaceutical industry. Well, should it be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years before this becomes a generic? Actually, the research there is not very clear. It depends on the sector. So my point is, it's a dynamic process. We should consider what else can come in. But just having a political process of saying, we don't like this, remove it, or we like this, as you say, put it, is not how you end up with a true understanding of what drives economic development. But the pressure is there. Your point, yes, the pressure is daily, weekly, and annually there on the team.
So, Jim, you're a very committed neoliberal ideologue. What do you think is missing from the ratings?
I'm not sure what's missing, but I did want to go back to this point about the index. But you have this sort of period where there seems to be this pushback against, quote unquote neoliberalism. And I read this criticism of the index, and perhaps you've heard it. And I love reading in front of people, so I'm going to do that. At a more philosophical level, the index measures the cost of government regulation, but none of the benefits of those regulations. And it's an extreme libertarian stance, out of step with much of the World Bank's other work. Viewed through the lens of doing business, corporate taxes are a pure bad, with no consideration of the benefits that come from raising tax revenue. We spoke about that earlier. Safety regulations and minimum wages are pure bads because they slow down business, with no consideration of the benefits to workers or customers. On almost all dimensions, a Hobbesian state of nature would get the best possible doing business score.
This is from Das Kapital of Karl Marx or somebody else?
It's not from Das Kapital.
It sounds like it.
From the Center for Global Development.
Well, it's the same, basically. So, yes, it's the same. So Marx.
But given what we're seeing in Chile, which people are using as, see, neoliberalism in bed, it doesn't work, it's the failure. I imagine this criticism will get even more play now than it has in the past.
But I don't think we should undermine and just say it's Marxist. I mean, I think that there is a legitimate debate not surrounding the doing business, but I do think that there is a legitimate debate on the extent to which markets have failures, to the extent that government can play a role in fixing those failures, which would be Pareto optimal, sometimes through regulation. So I don't think we should just undermine
certainly,
it.
One of the Democratic candidates say, well, yeah, we don't want to take the taxes back to 35%, but we're going to use that money for health care or free college. I thought we wanted to have better education, and that money will be used for good things, which more than outweighs any sort of investment disincentives that they would call that the return to old rates would cause.
And if actually, So then it's politics, right? So you can come up with a country. Denmark is a good example of a country like that. Does actually great on the doing business rate. So you cannot say that if you just have high taxes and you decide to regulate a lot, you're terrible. In fact, Denmark, I think, is number 4 on the doing business index and has been like that for the last 15, 17 years. It actually has very high taxes, as you know.
I mean, a lot of the indicators are things like how long does it take to get electricity when you set up a shop, right? You know, like that's not an ideological thing. I don't think even committed Marxists would argue that you need to wait for at least 20 days before you can get electricity to your shop.
No, committed Marxists, I've dealt with them, they argue against anything.
Sure. Yeah.
Reform Marxists may have a view. But then, so I have, again, 2 answers to this. The first answer is CGD, you mentioned, reform Marxists. So my answer to them is, great, so why don't you create your own index? So we have this index, it's called the cost of doing business. It's not called the cost of running a society, it's not called the benefits of running a society, it's called the cost of doing business. So is it true in advertising? It is. So CGD should create an index that says the benefits of doing business or the benefits of regulation. They should have a great index, it should be as famous as our index, and then that index plus our index would actually be the truth. But they can't. They don't really have anyhow, they don't have many things, so they cannot create it. So then it's much easier to basically say, you should do it. Well, why should we do it? We've called it the cost of doing business, so it exactly represents what we want to do. But then more philosophically, since they seem to be singing philosophical tunes, the reason that we look at the cost of doing business is that you do want to ask the question, what is the government about? And in well-run countries, and the US is one of these countries, regardless of what we discuss on corporate taxation, you can come up with the argument that you just made. We'll raise taxes and we'll provide social services, or we'll build infrastructure, which is terrible, by the way, in most of the US, so we should invest it. And by and large, we expect the government to be able to do it. But in Mozambique, in Pakistan, in the vast variety of countries around the world, is it true that if they manage to raise more taxes, they would actually, without any corruption and with great efficiency, invest? No, they're going to steal this money. So then the question is, do you want the tax level and the regulation that constrain businesses, and let's assume that you collect the money and basically just waste it completely? Or is it actually better to have a level of regulation that fits the institutional development of this country? And that's where the committed or uncommitted Marxists cannot answer.
But should there be
I'm a little sad. I invited a couple of CGD guys to sit in the panel. They couldn't make it. It's unfortunate.
But
Yes.
should there be a different index then for advanced, rich world economies and other economies? If, for instance, an issue like taxation will be, might be viewed very differently.
So that's where the research comes, and we do ask now more and more this question of not just what's the optimal level of regulation or taxation, but depending on a country income level, what is, rich countries, middle income countries, poor countries, what is the right level of regulation, just factually, based on the research. And you do get sometimes, like in starting a business, as Tan mentioned, basically the faster the better for everybody, because it's like a no-brainer. It's not a right-wing thing, it's also a left-wing thing. You want people to have money. But once you get to some more sophisticated things like corporate taxation, yeah, if you can use it for good to build roads, maybe it should be somewhat higher if you invest well. But then rich countries probably would be able to do that. I can tell you, Mozambique will just, siphon it off, as they have siphoned off many other sources of public data. So you want to be careful how much you want to collect there. So yes, I think research can give us different levels of the optimal level of taxation or regulation.
You're all looking at me.
Because you seem to be the...
No, I want to say, no, I do want to say...
As the quasi-Marxist on stage.
Yes, exactly. Thanks
look, I'm an economist. I think economics has thankfully moved to be more of a science in the past decades, and I think that's there is space for debate ideologically, but I think that we have very good evidence that people can't. So I do want to say I do have great colleagues at CGD. I think that they're very serious and they do a lot of work. So I do think it's important to, be respectful of everybody's work and be willing to engage in a discussion. I agree with you that when you look at these, I really agree with you. That these indexes are trying to measure something that is very specific, and in that sense is doing a good job. I just want to say that and this is not a question to you, I'm just saying generally as a follow-up to this discussion, is that these comments come out of a context, and come out of a context in which there are several tools useful to promote development and economic growth. And what we've seen in the world in the past few decades, this is an undisputable fact, is that as countries have grown, as poor countries have grown, inequality has risen dramatically. We see that in the US. And I think it's legitimate to think about the tools which might have nothing to do with doing business, but some of them might when you think about taxes, the tools that you have at your disposal to deal with some of the issues, some of the market failures, the majority of the market failures that do exist, or also rising inequality, which we can get a whole discussion about whether that's important for growth or not, and who cares. I care about inequality, but I think that there are tools. There's a space in which things overlap, and I think many of those comments come from that context, and I think it's important to put it in context. I don't think that we should have an ideological discussion about these people are Marxist and then we shouldn't listen to them. I think that it's a bit more complex than that.
It always is more complex than that, but it still doesn't answer my question. If CGD has a different development paradigm in mind, why don't we actually create an index that fits that paradigm, and then that index would compete with our index on doing analysis, not us, not them, other people would do analysis and say, is it that this is more correlated with development and reduced inequality, or is it that? Because otherwise it's an argument of, we don't like this, but we don't have anything instead of this. And I do think this is why I started with Morales and so on. I think inequality is actually a huge issue in many countries around the world, in rich countries as well as in poor countries. It's a huge issue in Latin America, has been for centuries and seems to continue to be. And this is why I started the way that I started. So what's inequality about? It's somehow, in the past, ideology, as you said, has been, okay, right-wing people care about growth and left-wing people care about redistribution or inequality. Well, I'm a generally center-right person. I actually care a lot about inequality, because unless you pull everybody, sooner or later social unrest is going to come, and it's going to obliterate the benefits of what you've built. And we've seen this in many countries, not just in Latin America. But then it begs the question, how do you reduce inequality? And my argument is that some of this is redistribution, so you provide better public services, because unless people are educated, they're not going to pull up. So just very basic public, unless people have good sanitation and don't get sick kids so often, you cannot pull up. So there's some
For which you need taxes.
For which you need taxes, exactly. So you need to raise more taxes. But the moment you get to the raising taxes, you then ask the next question, are these taxes actually going to be used for something good, or are they going to be used so that, the Mozambican example of, $2 billion went into the hands of Credit Suisse and finance people essentially to invest in lavish lifestyles and so on. So you need to worry about that, because that in itself, while it doesn't create inequality across the whole society, it creates this huge perception that something is wrong in society. And what I'm making here is an argument that some of our data, I'm not saying at all that our data explains everything, but some of our data is correlated with the rise of inequality in certain countries, because if you cannot start your business, how else are you going to get rich? You work for state-owned enterprises. But I agree with you, we need to take everybody seriously. So I'm far from not taking the CGD people seriously. I wish they take themselves seriously and actually do some real work rather than criticizing other people's work all the time.
Excellent. I'm going to change gears a little bit. I have a question that I've always wondered about. Do you have a sense, so the rating is based on the cost of doing business in each country's main city for business activity or the main two. Do you have a sense of how much that matters for the ranking? Right? Because obviously, in Luxembourg it doesn't matter, right? But in some countries it'll matter a lot whether you only look at the largest city or at the country in whole. Right? China, which does well, also has entire regions where half of the population is in concentration camps, and presumably that makes doing business difficult. Do you have a sense of how much the ranking is driven by?
Houston versus New York would make a big difference, of course, even in well-advanced countries that make. So in a number of countries, we have what we call subnational doing business, where not just the largest city, but 20, 30 cities. We've done this: Mexico, Brazil, Russia, Nigeria, So in a number of countries, mostly middle-income countries, we've done this same exercise that we see here globally, but across the country. And the answer is it matters a lot. So there is huge variation within a country, particularly in federal states. So it's correlated, of course, to country size, but it's also correlated to federations. So a country like the US or like Indonesia or Pakistan, because a lot of regulation is at the federal level, and I think this is a good thing, it shows the democracy, you have huge variations across across states within the country and cities. And that actually provides some competition. Even in the US, you often see this, Colorado is the best place to do business.
Rick Barry used to constantly go to California to try and
Steal.
steal business. Yeah, and then he ended up
So there is variation, and our methodology needs to be cognizant and is cognizant of that if you're representing, purely for cost reasons, frankly, a particular large business city, that may be very different from the rest of the country. Less an issue for small countries.
But just to follow up on that, you have a situation where, so the two cities you're looking at are New York and Los Angeles, and you have California, which seems to be taking the lead on a lot of regulation. They've just passed a law involving freelancing and the sharing economy. They've passed a big new privacy law. They also have seemingly they have an electricity problem in California. Might that
seemingly yes?
might that cause again? How might that affect sort of the U.S. rankings going forward? If you have a key city in a state which seems to be doing something maybe and having problems very different than the rest of the country.
It does, and therefore there has been a discussion very recently in the last few months that in very large federal states like the US, like India, like Indonesia, we should consider more than the two cities that you mentioned, because if you go just the mental experiment here in the US, third city is Chicago, fourth city is Houston, I already mentioned. Very different cities. I'm sure that if these two cities are measured with the same methodology, there will be, well, for Houston, I'm fairly sure, it will be a lot business friendlier than either actually LA or New York. With new ways of collecting data, this is where technology starts helping us. Becoming actually much cheaper to do that. Like when we started nearly 20 years ago, huge cost to do it. Now it's become a bit easier, so it is possible to go in that direction, and I think you would get different results in the US. My hypothesis is you would get better results. So these third, fourth cities would be business friendliest. In other countries, you may actually get the opposite, because so much business is concentrated in the main city that the moment you move out of it, it's less business friendly. But it is a concern.
So I want to, before going to the audience, I want to close out with a question about the public procurement processes. You briefly said that the way in which the EU deals with this, you don't think is a particularly helpful one. A lot of the regulations there are really, the proclaimed reason to have them is often to make it difficult for insiders to get their bids in without much competition from across the union. And so so your sense is simply that doesn't work, and that it simply adds a layer of bureaucracy, but that the ultimate outcome is that the insiders still get the projects? Why do you think that?
It's actually worse than that. So when we started the procurement project, I was like, with age, I'm starting to be more left-wing. So this was my...
I can tell.
So that was my kind of call to center-left. So I was very certain that we would find that more regulation in procurement is surely better, because it provides more transparency. We're talking about huge amounts of public money, so it has to be very seriously, let's say, taken into account, which is different from, let's say, starting a business, where we would agree that, in principle, small businesses starting, these are not nuclear businesses, these are not chemical plants, probably the easier the better for everyone, at least initially, and then you regulate them once they become larger and so on. In procurement, we find strikingly the opposite result of what I just told you, meaning that more regulation is universally associated with worse outcomes. More time, higher overruns in terms of money, you would have expected this. But what you don't expect, more collusion, less competition, more bribes, basically every bad thing that you can think of comes out, and not just in poor countries where you'd expect it, but also in the OECD countries. So you start thinking, and we've been thinking for years, not a few weeks, Why is that the case? And basically, you go to Gary Becker and the classical economists, which is that what you have created is entry barrier. So suddenly, there are very few firms that can actually deal with this extreme level of regulation. These are large firms. They have many accountants, many lawyers. You have to be rich to be able to deal with that. And you're so large that you actually are lobbying for more regulation, and we show this in some countries, essentially to exclude others. So you end up, and this often happens around the world, you end up with, even in large countries, with very, very few companies that actually can deal with this level of regulation. So you've created a regulatory environment which basically kicks out everybody but the chosen few. And once you've gotten to this level of concentration, what do you expect? There'll be more bribes, there'll be more collusion, it would be slower, and it would cost a lot more. So you want it to be good, and I also want to be good, by the way, so it's not that I'm like
I'm not judging.
Okay, you've been looking at me in a very mean way, so please direct it elsewhere. But you want to be good, but somehow, in politicians, I think most politicians want to be good. They've just created the perfect legal environment to collude.
Excellent. Let's take some questions from the audience. Please, when I point at you, please wait for a mic and then tell me your name and affiliation. I'm going to start right over here because otherwise you're out of my line of sight and I won't get to you.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating panel. I ran a business association dealing with one of the former Soviet republics for 15 years and saw this process of the doing business index be gamed. When you look at the different categories that you have in the 12 or so different ranking areas, I'd ask, how do you weight those in coming up with your final scores? Because it seems to me that some countries like to take hits in certain areas in order to look good in the others. Because this is foreign direct investment window dressing for a lot of countries, in addition to something that they will say is to improve their domestic economies.
So there is some gaming. I should say that I started doing business, then went to my own government, went to academia, and have recently come back. So this is actually my first report after nearly a decade.
Did you game it effectively when you were in Bulgaria?
No, I was staying away from it, although I can tell you how I did entry reform. Bulgaria used to have one of the highest minimum capital requirements for companies. That's because notaries were very stuck on it. So to pass it through parliament, I had to redirect traffic. I was also deputy prime minister, so had some other powers, so that the leaders of the notary associations couldn't make it to parliament on time, and then it passed. So I gamed it in that way, but this was perfectly legitimate. All red lights happened to be very long on a particular path. And we have now €1 to start a business from around €3,000 at the time. But Bulgaria actually is not doing very well on this ranking. There is some gaming. The gaming happens exactly what you said. Seemingly democratic, sometimes not so seemingly. You use the word seeming, so I'm using it as well. Countries that sort of care a lot about their outlook outside. And then to do that, they are willing to cut some corners, and even though the methodology should be robust because it goes to the private sector and ask private sector companies what they think of the regulations and to give us the data and so on, if you're in a country that is used to central control, you end up with some silly results. To the extent possible, we try to capture this and then recruit new sets of respondents, which becomes a bit tedious year after year, but we increasingly also look at analysis. This is where the data come and say, well, is it possible that this country is so good here, and then on a variety of outside of sample, non-doing business indicators, it does so badly. But you're right, it is susceptible to this because it assumes kind of an unbiased government that just does the right thing and does not meddle. Governments do meddle, unfortunately, some more than others, and how to keep ahead of that has proven more challenging than I would have thought. That's where the conversation then becomes how much this matters relative to other things. And we started with that. Doing business, I'm very partial to it, obviously. I think it matters reasonably in most countries, but it's certainly not the first order on reducing inequality. So I would say that it's one of the things, maybe top 10 things. But if you're reducing inequality, there are many other things that you should consider first. Basic health, basic education, roads, and so on. So we try to reason with governments and say, if you're putting so much energy on this, if you put the same energy for some productive effort, maybe you'd be much better off. That argument has not yet been successful, but if it is, I will let you know.
Very good. Let's go over here.
Thank you. Piotr from SAIS, really fascinating things. We've talked a lot about ideology, so I want to bring it to a pragmatic case study for a minute, being the United Kingdom. In the next month, to the day, exactly 1 month, we will have a delightful general election with the potential, for our resident Marxist here, a potential to swing two very different ways.
Self-professed Marxists.
Well, yes, of course.
Better.
No, I'm joking. But I'm curious to hear your opinion on where what that could mean for not only the United Kingdom's ability to do business if Corbyn was to get in terms of his renationalisation of a few major industry like the railways, and also that the potential implications for the European area broader. Thank you.
So I think I actually happened to be, I mentioned that after the Bulgarian government, I went and taught at the London School of Economics for some time. So I was there actually when Brexit happened, and I remember both myself and all of my learned academic colleagues saying this is never going to happen. It's such an idiotic idea that they're never going to go for it. So we're all wrong. The majority of the British population did go for it. And then the question is, some of it was unrelated to economics, let's put it that way. But some of it was in the hope, I guess, that regulation, that economics somehow would improve. So what was that hope? So I've actually done studies on this in the last 3-4 years. So one hope was precisely what I said in the area of public procurement, that because Brussels regulates so much more, and that's shown by in our ranking, the UK is, I think, number 8, most of the European Union is in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on in terms of ranking. So clearly the UK, even within the European Union, was one of the better regulated countries. So there was certainly the claims by politicians that there will be much more business friendly after that, after they leave. And maybe that would happen. We are still to see.
The fact that there's multiple EU countries in the top 10 also suggests that even within the European Union you have.
That's right, and as I mentioned, Denmark is, I think, number 4. The UK is the next one, so there is some variety.
And the UK is mechanically, on some indicators, the UK is going to score worse, right? Because surely customs will be.
For some time at least, unless, of course, the UK, as has been claimed, not by
they
this
have magical
government.
technology, but
remember about 2 years ago, when Brexit happened, there was this claim, which actually for trade economists like myself by training would be great to say, we exit the union and we just open everything. So we just do 0 tariffs for everybody. We have basically free trade area for everybody. I doubt that would happen, but if that happened, and they could do it in principle, suddenly their business environment will improve. In the area of taxes, actually, they're not that much bound by the European regulation, because with the exception of VAT, actually European regulation does not touch yet taxes. There have been attempts, but these are not successful. And it was in the area of banking or finance where the biggest claims were made, that without European regulation, which is very heavy, especially after the Eurozone crisis, we would become an even bigger global center for finance. London already is the number 1 center, but the city of London would have become even bigger. In principle, this is possible. We have not really seen any evidence yet, partly because the politicians are so busy figuring out when, in fact, Brexit is going to happen. But you could see that even without ideology, just on the argument of we want to have a better functioning economy, some of these things can improve. The question on the other side is, what do you lose by not being part of the European Union market? Not the regulation of it, but just the market itself. If you lose this market and there are some tariffs or some constraints to services and so on. There's a lot of research on both sides. It basically says at first it would be minor effects, but surely they would increase over time. And the big bet that clearly has not worked so far, 2-3 years ago, was that the UK may leave the European market, but because they are such great friends with the US plus UK is actually much bigger than UK plus Europe. That bet, I think, is wrong. First of all, because in economics we learn about proximity. So US and UK can be great friends, but they're still far from each other. Europe is much closer, and you should trade with close partners, not with faraway partners. And actually the US and the UK, I think this is where the big bet would not work, compete in many sectors. So, you know, London is #1 financial center in the world, New York is #2. Well, if you look at continental Europe and you ask who is competing with London, nobody, because nobody else remotely has the City of London abilities. And there are many universities, you know, there are the universities here, there are the universities in the UK, and there's the rest of Europe. I'm not going to comment on universities, but you know, you can just look at rankings. So you compete in this area as well, one-to-one. So it's not really clear, in other words, why the US, even apart from ideology, would suddenly say we're so open for UK business. So the short answer is, I think there are many bets. There is very little research behind them. My own view is that the UK is losing in terms of economics as a result of exiting the European Union.
I would recommend your former colleague Tom Sampson has a 2017 Journal of Economic Perspectives paper, something like Brexit, the economic consequences of international disintegration. Very good overviews of the trade economics. All right, let's do a couple more questions. Let's see, right behind you.
Hello, I'm Grigory Saporchenko from Russian news agency TASS. And please, how can you comment Russian proposals made by this October to refine methodology of accounting? Thank you, on your report.
I'm not actually familiar too much with this particular methodology, but we have from a number of countries over the years, we've received comments from Russian authorities in the past at least. I'm familiar with some comments on the accounting/tax methodology, and our answer has been consistent, which is that the methodology applies to 190 countries around the world. So if a country like Russia feels wronged, then they should think, well, what about the other 189 countries? Is it that the doing business team purposefully designed a methodology that only hurts one country?
Which is possible, to be clear.
But then the other, it's theoretically,
It'll be a strange thing to do.
It'll be a very, very strange thing to do, and of course, dynamically over time, you'd have to keep kind of doing it in a particular manner. So it kind of looks very, very, very far-fetched. So my answer to that would be get real. This is the indicator. It's not going to change, and basically either you improve on it or you don't improve on it. We don't care. So you know, it's an indicator for the rest of for every country in the world, but there's no specific bias towards a country or group of countries and so on. It's an indicator based on research. The research of others is not just our own research. So we will look at it if it comes to us, and then we will move on.
Any more questions? No? Oh, over here.
Thanks. Chad Reese, the Institute for Justice. You may have seen that an economist out of ASU just recently released their Doing Business North America study, which takes a lot of this methodology and applies it to North American cities. I'm interested in doing some similar work. For those of us who are working, and I think Jim had a question about this earlier, for those of us who are interested in applying some of this methodology to more narrow sets, particularly back in already developed countries, do you have any insights from your experience or do any of the commentators have any insights after looking at this into things to definitely include in that type of work, or things that just absolutely do not work when you're looking at a smaller subset of particularly large United States cities.
Is your goal to compare U.S. cities to cities abroad or to each other? Yeah.
So there are some sets of indicators that differ a lot because they are locally, if you like, implemented, especially in federal states. So like starting a business, licenses, getting electricity connections and so on are very local in nature. So you surely get a lot of differences across not just states, even municipalities, both to have your analysis more interesting, but also to affect reform. Because if you want the cities to improve, you give them something that actually is in their hands. And there are parts of the methodology that are federal by nature, like bankruptcy. Like even a country like the US does not have a bankruptcy code that's specific to Mississippi or Alabama and so on. So you're likely in this latter set of indicators to get some differences, but it is more from the efficiency of courts, if you like, not from the legislation itself. So then you should ask yourself the question, do I want to record differences and then affect legislators or local politicians, in which case you should just look at the former set of indicators, or do I want to get kind of to the question of which we've discussed, what's a better place to do business? In which case, it would matter whether the courts in Alabama are better or faster, more efficient, cheaper than the courts in Massachusetts and so on. So it depends what your unit of impact is. And if the unit of impact is, I want these cities or these municipalities to do better, focus on about half of the indicators, because that's where they can actually affect it. So again, labor regulation is federal in the vast majority of countries around the world, including actually in the US, other than the minimum wage. Bankruptcy is the same, shareholder rights is the same, and then there are a number of indicators that do depend on at the state level.
So let me take the last question. Why is New Zealand number one, and has it produced a utopia? It looks very beautiful in the Lord of the Rings
It does actually. It's one of the very few countries I've visited by now, 113 countries around the world through work mostly. New Zealand is not one of them, so I don't quite know. Maybe it's because we're so far that like the different ideologies that have developed over the last 30 years haven't yet reached them, and had they realized that, they would have a more sophisticated and complex way to regulate, but eventually it will get to them. But so far they have been consistently there. More seriously, it's a small homogeneous population. You do see at the top that they are very homogeneous small societies: Singapore, Hong Kong, Denmark, and so on. It is, and there's a lot of research to suggest this, it is a lot easier to regulate less if society is much more cohesive, because you can agree kind of on trust and rules of the game. You don't have to impose formal regulation. We can agree if it's just the few of us and we share common principles and so on. Once you get to a large federal state with lots of different competing notions of what society is going to be, much more complicated, which actually makes the US, it's the largest country and consistently has been in our indicator, as in many other indicators developed by think tanks in the US and so on economic freedom. It's consistently being number one in the world, which is much more difficult to do if you're the US than if you're Singapore or New Zealand.
Well, on that very optimistic note, I would like to thank you all for coming. Thanks to our panelists. Thank you, Simeon. Hopefully, once you have your procurement numbers ready, you can roll them out here.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, guys. Thank you.